So kind of like the assumption that things like education, work, and money matter, that's a correct assumption. But what I think people don't appreciate, right, is that marriage, particularly a good marriage, is a better predictor of happiness. And so what I find is that, reporting that you're happily married in this survey blows every other variable out of the water.
Professor Wilcox, thanks so much for sitting down with me.
It's good to be here, Lila.
I've been an admirer of your work for a long time. You're a professor, a sociologist, an author. But how did you first get passionate about writing and studying marriage, family, and relationships?
Yeah, so I was raised by a single mom in the 70s. And as I kind of look back on that time of life, the vast majority of my friends grew up in homes with, divorced parents. And so that's kind of part of my, life growing up, kind of being exposed to a lot of family instability. And then as I got older and kind of moved into college at the University of Virginia, I kind of was sort of realizing that, in terms of connecting men to their families, that marriage is pretty important. But if we want to kind of build a world where more, kids are being raised by their own fathers, we need to think about kind of how do we sort of strengthen marriage. And so that was, kind of the genesis of my interest in this topic, kind of, having this childhood experience, kind of not having a father in the picture. My dad died when I was 3, and sort of realizing, that these were important, obviously, experiences for me, but for kids across the country in this time when there's been so much family change in America.
In our pro-life work, we often share this statistic: 9 out of every 10 women who have an abortion are unmarried, are single. And they might be in a relationship, but they're unwed. So why should pro-lifers care so much about marriage?
Yeah, so I think what we see kind of in the research is that the primary alternative to abortion is marriage, right? And so when people kind of feel secure, when they trust their spouse, when they feel like they're in a good place, they're much more likely to sort of welcome life into their lives. And so, a decent marriage, a good marriage is obviously the best place to have a child. And so when marriage is strong in our culture, and when people are in good marriages, then there's going to be obviously less interest in, less need for, in sort of their view, abortion. So the good news about kind of family in America is that sort of the kind of dramatic increase in family instability that I experienced as a kid in the 70s and 80s has bottomed out. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a slight uptick in the share of kids who are being raised in married families. And that's because divorce actually has also come down since 1980, basically. And the share of kids who are being born outside of marriage has leveled off since 2009. So when you kind of level off non-marital childbearing and when you bring down divorce, that basically leads to more family stability for the kids who are being born in recent years. And then since 2009, we saw like from the 60s to about 2009, just kind of a relentless increase in the share of kids being born outside of marriage. But that levels off in 2009, Great Recession, but also the arrival of smartphones as well, soon thereafter. And so since that period, we've seen no increase in the share of kids who are being born outside of marriage. So that's good news in the sense that more kids are being raised by their own married parents in America in recent years. So a slight uptick in that trend. So that's the good news. So what's the bad news, right? The bad news, of course, is that marriage has become a lot more selective. That means it's become much more of a kind of almost even elite kind of thing, a luxury good, as some people would describe it, right? So marriage has fallen by about 65% since 1970 when I was born. And it's become increasingly kind of the place where more educated, more affluent, and also more religious Americans are kind of parking their serious relationships in their family life. So because it's become more selective, the kids who are being born into marriage are enjoying more stable family lives, and that's kind of the good news. But the bad news is that more and more American adults are not going to have the benefit of getting married, are not going to have the benefit of also having children. So we're seeing kind of the fertility rates falling pretty dramatically since 2009 as well, right? And so family life has become a lot more, again, selective for people who are more educated, more affluent, or more religious. And Americans who are working class, Americans who are poor, Americans who are secular, Americans who are liberal, are going to be much less likely to get married, in this new world that we're living in. And that's actually sad, because marriage is not a conservative thing. It's not even a religious thing. It's a human thing. And so we're living now in a world where, again, more young adults will not have the benefit of this incredible institution.
So what are the factors stopping these different groups from getting married? You've made the comment that there are more privileged groups, more educated, more money, more religious, that are the ones that get married the most. What about the rest, and what's holding them back?
Yeah, there are obviously a lot of things driving this sort of retreat from marriage, and we're seeing this not just in the U.S., but across the globe. I mean, East Asia is in a terrible spot right now when it comes to marriage. But in terms of like what's happening in the U.S., what I would say is there's kind of like a Midas mindset, I think, that's kind of captivated the minds of many young adults, even many parents we're seeing now in recent Pew data. And the idea with the Midas mindset is it's basically about glory, it's about education, it's about money, it's about job, career. And there's this thought that kind of those things will make me satisfied. Those things will make me fulfilled. So I think that's particularly prevalent among, many, more educated folks to some extent. Mm-hmm. There's also kind of among folks who are more secular and more progressive, I think that kind of work orientation is stronger. And they're also more individualistic. It's more about kind of what I want to do, what my agenda is. And so there's kind of less interest in marriage per se, and less interest in kind of moving towards a we before me mindset, right? And so those things tend to inhibit one's sort of move towards marriage. Now, when it comes to kind of like the class story in America, there's obviously a lot going on there. I talked, before kind of our conversation yesterday about the way in which many of our public policies now penalize marriage among working class couples with kids. So Medicaid, for instance, child care subsidies from the government, for instance. And so people are thinking about, is marriage really like the best thing for me to do, given that I might lose access to health care or access to child care, for my kids. So that's part of the story. But I think a much bigger part of the story is kind of the challenges that we're having with men who are not college educated. And so we're seeing with men who don't have that college degree, we're kind of not on that college track, who are not sort of strivers by today's, language, is that they're much more likely to be floundering when it comes to school and work. Often they're not working full time. Often their girlfriend or their wife is working more than they are. And this dynamic is not great, both for kind of thinking about getting married and then also for staying married. We see when it comes to divorce, for instance, that when a guy who's married loses his job, his risk of divorce shoots up by more than 30%.
Wow.
Okay. Loss of confidence, frustrations about maybe money. Oftentimes he doesn't do as much around the home. So there's just kind of all that stuff kind of plays out. But when the wife loses her job, no increase in divorce, right? So we're seeing kind of like this pervasive trend of men becoming disconnected from full-time work among working class and poor communities. That spells trouble for relationships. It spells trouble for marriage and family. So I think those are some of the cultural and economic reasons why we're seeing that, marriage is in retreat, particularly, in working class and poor communities. That's kind of known among people who kind of studies. But I think what people don't realize, though, is that these dynamics are also applicable for more cultural reasons to more secular and progressive Americans. So I'm seeing in my own research kind of a growing gap in singledom and also in childlessness between Americans who are religious and Americans who are secular, Americans who are conservative and Americans who are progressive. And I think that's because they have often different orientations towards things like work, obviously faith, family, marriage, just kind of the things that really matter for them. And so if you prioritize marriage as a 20-something, you're probably more intentional about looking around to find someone who would be marriageable and trying to, make that relationship work. Whereas if you think marriage is not that important, my job's really the most important thing at this point in my life, you're going to kind of deprioritize, love and marriage, and then look around in your 30s and you might or you might not find someone who kind of like, sort of fits your expectations for marriage. But by that point, your odds of finding the right person are going to be somewhat smaller. So these kinds of subtle decisions that sort of mark 20-something and 30-something lives are now implicated by people's, broader religious and cultural orientations.
One group is those that are not educated, are struggling, as you said, floundering in work.
Yeah.
And so maybe they don't feel that they're equipped, or their values that they grew up with. They grew up in a single parent home, so it's difficult for them to imagine or to live, that marriage. So there's that group. And then there's the group of the people that are very educated, that are strivers, I think was the word you used. And both of them lead to less marriage.
Right. So again, I think we've had this big narrative in the culture about how class is the big driver of the, this retreat from marriage. And there is a big class divide when it comes to marriage and family life. That's important, But again, I think the newer piece that my book is sort of focusing on in part is the way in which culture is also a big driver of contemporary marriage and family trends. And, the folks who are kind of embracing, as I said, this Midas mindset are more likely to find themselves in their 30s and 40s without a spouse, without children. But on a more constructive note, too, I do kind of locate 4 groups in the book who are more likely today to get married and to be stably married and reasonably happy married. And that's folks who are Asian American, folks who are the faithful religious Americans, folks who are conservative, ideologically speaking, but then also the strivers. The strivers still tend to do the kind of, at least right now, and that could change, depending upon where they sit on the ideological spectrum, but they do tend to forge reasonably stable marriages, at least right now.
What are the marriage rates for the strivers? Let's talk about them for a minute.
So if you think about strivers in terms of college-educated Americans, is sort of like one way of thinking about that, we would see that, most of them are going to get married and be stably married and have kids today. And that could change in the next generation, but kind of for folks who are in their, 40s and 50s, they're stably married, they've got kids. Whereas Americans who don't have that college degree are not typically going to live their entire lives in a stable marriage. So that's a big class divide when it comes to sort of your odds of being stably married with kids in America.
But then there's that group within the college educated who hit their 30s or even their 40s, and they are unable or struggling to get married, and then they struggle to conceive and have children. And I hear a lot of conversation today about that group. It's so hard to find somebody.
Right.
I think there's a lot of discontentedness where people maybe made it to some degree in their career, and then they're like, wait a minute, what about this other piece that I thought was going to happen to me, materialize at some point?
Yeah, and so I do see a lot of students at UVA, for instance, who will come into my office, female students, and they're already kind of aware of these kinds of trends, and they're kind of concerned about, their prospects for finding a spouse. But there are other students too, I think they're not really cognizant of kind of like some of these newer challenges, and they're much more focused on kind of like just really pushing work, for the next decade and a half. And they're not really thinking about how that might affect their shot at marriage. So I think those two groups are sort of like, probably ironically, the students who are kind of more concerned about and intentional about marriage are probably going to have greater shot at actually getting married, whereas the students that I see who are kind of like really focused on their career for the next 15 years probably will end up having a bit more difficulty. But I also see among the strivers, or among those who are college educated, a pretty, decent divide between those who are conservative and those who are progressive. And so the happiest group in America, both in terms of marital happiness, but also happiness in general, are conservative, college-educated Americans.
Married or unmarried?
Married. I mean, but
okay.
One reason that they're more likely to be happy is also in terms of the larger population is they're more likely to be married and stably married.
They're more likely to value that and share that.
So college-educated, conservative Americans, who are a minority, obviously, of college-educated Americans, they're the ones who I think they tend to have both sort of the cultural and the economic resources, and often decent marriages that allow them to flourish and their kids to flourish,
So it sounds like you're saying it's the combination of conservative values, and that often comes with faith and, religious attendance, in addition to education, so better prospects, maybe economically, that make for the happiest people in America.
Right. Of course, and there are different ways people can kind of do this. And so, as I mentioned before, we see also that Asian Americans are doing very well when it comes to family life, and also very well when it comes to education. So, and they're not necessarily all that religious in some communities, and not even conservative in some communities as well, right? So, but they have been able to kind of draw upon a certain kind of heritage, whether it's kind of a Confucianism or some kind of commitment, from South Asia that facilitates that orientation to marriage and family that suits them well too.
What are the greatest barriers to marriage for young people today?
So I think one of the barriers that we've touched on is kind of the idea that a lot of young men are floundering. And so both, I think, in their own eyes and the eyes of their partner, they don't see themselves kind of as marriageable. I think a kind of individualism that would want to sort of look at life through the prism of what makes me happy, what do I want to do, rather than kind of trying to look at what, a romantic partner and then what a spouse would like you to do, what your kids want you to do. So kind of not having that orientation towards someone besides oneself, that kind of, contemporary American individualism. I think that technology is increasingly a barrier to marriage. People are spending so much time on screens that they're not kind of cultivating kind of in-person relationships, both friendships and dating relationships that would lead them to get married. I think we're seeing as well, people are not kind of plugging into civic and religious institutions in their local communities that would tend to sort of, support them and facilitate the move to marriage as well. So these are some of the barriers that we see when it comes to marriage. But I think we don't, sufficiently value marriage among young adults today. And we don't kind of do a good job of preparing young men to be good partners and good workers. And so these two dynamics really help to make marriage a lot more difficult for this younger generation than for people getting married in previous decades.
1950s, you had a very different, it was sort of an expectation that everyone would get married. And I think the large majority of people did, is my understanding. That's not the case today. I've heard increasingly some people blaming feminism, or at least the feminism that has hyper-valued women in the workforce, women outside of the home. And they say, well, men being driftless today and not wanting to get married is because there's so few women that seem that they'll really go all in on the project of whatever the man's working on so that he can be the leader of the family. What's your take on that analysis of where we're at today?
So yeah, when it comes to feminism, I think obviously there are a lot of great things and then some things that have been, not so great when it comes to kind of its impact on marriage and family life, and both for men and for women as well. So what I see in the book is that on kind of the more plus side, I think kind of what I do see is that men today who get married and are dads are much more engaged with their kids. And that's in part, I think, because of the expectations that feminism is kind of basically directed towards men. And so I see, for instance, that both for conservative and progressive couples, wives are just a lot happier when their husbands are really deeply engaged in the life of the kids, So that means being, hands-on in evenings, weekends, all that kind of stuff. So that's I think, a consequence of some of the good effects of feminism.
Nancy Pearcey, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she just came out with a book called the Toxic War On Masculinity.
Sure.
And her theory is interesting. She says that historically men actually were really engaged in the home to the point of even being physically at home or in the home doing their work. And they shared a lot of roles. There were some differences, but they shared a lot with their family and worked alongside their family. So in a way, they were much more engaged in the hearth and the life of the home.
So I think that perspective would describe a lot of 19th century, right? Families and people living on farms or blacksmiths or whatnot, where obviously you had couples living in a home and sharing a kind of a business in a sense together. And so that would have been the case. But if you kind of look at trends from the 50s to the present, we do see a kind of a dramatic increase in the amount of time that men are spending with their kids, right?
So they're kind of course correcting the Industrial Revolution that took men out of the home for 12-hour days, and then they came home and there was no bandwidth for the life of the home.
Right, and, make sacrifices. So in my book, for instance, I talk about, a former Army officer who turned down a lot of opportunities to kind of go to particular bases or, take opportunities that came this way in the Army. And he did so because he knew that travel would be bad for his wife and kids. So he's kind of like, he's making decisions with kind of a family first mentality that I think is in some ways new and different, probably different than the way his dad would have approached work and family, So that's an example of kind of a newer mindset that's indebted in part to feminism. Now, I think where we get into some trouble, though, is that feminism often kind of discounts this idea that women and men are in some ways different and have different interests in marriage, different orientations to marriage. They tend to parent differently. And so I think feminism, because it's kind of reluctant to sort of understand and appreciate the ways in which women and men are different, can make it difficult for ordinary couples to navigate things like parenthood, things like, conflict in relationships. So just for example, my wife and I first got married, we would have difficulty kind of navigating kind of conflict and challenges, because when I'm facing some kind of difficulty in my life or in marriage, I tend to kind of just shut down. I want to be left alone. Whereas when my wife is facing a difficulty or some kind of conflict, she wants to talk it through. And so she was expecting me to sort of talk about whatever I was wrestling with. And I wanted just to be left alone and sort of wrestle with it and then circle back with her. Whereas when she was kind of experiencing some kind of challenge or difficulty, she wanted me to be kind of empathetic and, talk through things and not try to fix it, all that kind of stuff. And we didn't really kind of appreciate at that point in our marriage that women and men often approach, difficult things and conflicts in different ways. So I think there's been a wage feminism because it kind of, basically denies these differences, often leaves people with a kind of a bad toolkit for navigating marriage, family life, work, and family decisions, because they kind of have this default assumption that everything should be kind of split 50-50, and that women and men approach relationships in much the same way. And that's just not true for, in part, biological reasons. So I think that's been probably one of the ways in which feminism has been, less than helpful for recent couples and marriages. It's kind of fostering a mindset that expects that, sex doesn't really shape how people approach their relationships and sort of how they're oriented towards parenting and work and family decisions as well.
There's a lot of debate in some circles right now about what are the proper roles of a father versus a mother, of a husband versus a wife. And there's a lot of, I think, even hot takes online about what this looks like and claims, big claims about how this looked historically. It's funny as I look at some of these claims, such as, the man had nothing to do with child rearing, and historically, and then you look back, you read Piercy's, very careful historical analysis about, men working very closely with their very young children. In your research, what does the data show about, with broad strokes, generally speaking, the maximally, the maximization of the family unit in terms of the role of the father, husband, versus the role of the wife, mother?
Yeah. So in terms of, marital happiness, I've seen some work done, including by colleagues, that kind of suggested that sort of basically, the more that the wife earned in the marriage, the worse the marriage was. And so I kind of looked at that question. We've got a big new survey that we did with YouGov of 2,000, married men and women in the U.S. to kind of look at these kinds of issues. So I was like, well, is that still true today? What other kinds of things do we see in terms of just gender roles and people's approach to married life? It was really more about kind of having a husband who is employed full time. That was kind of like, that predicted better outcomes for the women, particularly the married moms in my sample. And then kind of having the ability to sort of do what she wanted. So for some women that would be work full time, some work part-time, and some to be at home full-time with the kids. So what I'm saying to you is kind of like the precise division of kind of earnings, for instance, and sort of what the wife was doing wasn't a huge deal for these contemporary married couples, but it was the case that women were likely to be more happy, especially if they were moms, if their husband was employed full-time. And that sort of dovetails with the sort of larger research that I just referenced. Harvard study on divorce, for instance, that I just talked about, finding that, again, for men, when they lose their job, big risk, of divorce. When the wives lose their job, no risk of divorce. There's something about, even today in 2023, men having a full-time job that seems to be good, for them and for their wives and their families. Whereas kind of how women are kind of navigating work and family seems to be less, an issue for contemporary couples.
And so this is an analysis more of a stable job, full-time for the husband, for the father. Yep. The mother can have a full-time job or a part-time job or even no job, but provided, and those different scenarios can work well, but the key is that stable job, full-time, that satisfactory job for him. Right. Okay, well, what about the children? What about the children? This is also another debate.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of strain on a family to have two intense jobs that take the parents
Sure.
away from the kids. You know, young children, a lot of research has been done on this. Young children need to bond with their mother, you know, not just some caretaker that they're shipped off to, their mother. What does the research say about the ideal role, not just for the parents' happiness, but for the children's flourishing?
So I think there's a lot of debate about sort of how parents navigate kind of the lives of their school-age children. And one, you know, scholar that I know, Don Browning, is no longer living, kind of talked kind of the 60 hours rule. So kind of his view was that kind of families could sort of, you know, divvy up things as they please, but they shouldn't have, you know, the two parents working more than 60 hours a week when they have you know, combined, yes, school-age kids. I think that's probably a pretty good rule. But in terms of younger kids, and I think a lot of Americans don't realize this, you know, a lot of Americans don't realize this. There is a, you know, a pretty good body of evidence, and it's sort of validated by, you know, scholars at progressive, you know, feminist scholars at places like Columbia University, that in that first year of life, you know, kids are much more likely to thrive with a primary caretaker, which is usually the mom. And if they're spending too much time in institutional care in some kind of childcare setting, you know, more than 15 or 30 hours, depending upon, you know, your assessment of the data, those kids are more likely to have social and emotional challenges. So I think where there is, you know, a pretty good consensus among those people who are kind of reputable is that in that, again, that first year of life, kids need a lot of time, usually with the mom. And so I think we'd be better both sort of culturally and policy-wise to think about ways to, you know, give kids, you know, especially more mom time in that first year of life.
All right, so I want to get to that, but before respond on what you're saying with another question. But you said something else that was really interesting, which is you referenced a sociologist, I think has passed, but he said that his research found that for the school-age child, 60 hours a week between both parents, meaning if one parent has a 60-hour-a-week job, the other parent shouldn't work at all. Or if they have a 40-hour job, the other parent should only work 20 hours. Is that?
So that was just kind of his framework. I mean, I think, you know, and there are going to be debates in, you know, among sociologists and psychologists about kind of what, you know, but his point was that you kind of need to have, you know, time set aside for kids. And, you know, it helps to have someone at home, you know, when kids come home from school, you know, so all these things. So I think recognizing you can't have both parents kind of killing it, you know, professionally, if you want kids to have some real connections with their parents and have some kind of one on the home front who's really, you know, with them and for them.
And for that young child, back to the second part of what you said, you know, there is some folks who would argue, well, the mother and the father are completely interchangeable.
Sure.
So for that very young child, you know, the research says it just has to be a primary bond with some, you know, biological caregiver. It doesn't have to be the mother. I mean, I disagree with that. I think, you know, day-to-day life experience just shows how important the mother is uniquely for that young child. But what does the research show about that?
We don't really have like a lot of evidence right now on, you know, on stay-at-home dads in, say, that first year of life. So I think, you know, most of the evidence on sort of this question to date has been focusing on stay-at-home mothers, you know, compared to other arrangements. So what I would say is that we know right now that kids are most likely to flourish socially and emotionally when they have their own mother at home for that first year of life for some substantial, you know, part of the week. Now, is it the case that a stay-at-home dad in that first year of life might, you know, be able to do really well? Possibly. But right now, the evidence that I've seen is that, you know, kids benefit from having that stable caregiver at home, and that's, you know, generally the mom.
Well, and going back to the other research, which shows to make that marital maximum happiness, having the dad, the father, the husband have that full-time gainful employment. Yeah. So it would be very hard for any man to be a stay-at-home dad and maintain that rootedness with the family.
I know a number of guys who are happily married, stably married, you know, good dads who have been stay-at-home dads for parts of their kids' lives. And so that's an important reality to acknowledge. But on average, I do find that women who are married to stay-at-home dads are somewhat less likely to be happy compared to women who are, you know, married to men who are dads and working full time. So we do see that that, women who are married to stay-at-home dads are somewhat less likely to be very happy in their marriages.
What would be sort of your prescription for the Midas touch-minded individual who, generally speaking at large, our culture, and I don't know that this is wrong by itself, to pursue education, to be the best you can be in your career, to maximize your talents and your usefulness in society, which I think is generally the positive motivators of the Midas touch group.
Right.
What is the prescription, though, to temper that in order to put family first?
Yeah, so I think it's important, obviously, to acknowledge. So I looked at in this large national data set called the General Social Survey. It's kind of like it's the gold standard for sort of like looking at American attitudes and experiences and a lot of different outcomes. So the GSS tells us that Americans who've got a college degree are more likely to be happy with their lives, that Americans who are happy with their jobs are more likely to be happy with their lives, that Americans who have above average income are more likely to be happy with their lives. So kind of like the assumption that things like education, work, and money matter, that's a correct assumption. But what I think people don't appreciate, right, is that marriage, particularly a good marriage, is a better predictor of happiness. And so what I find is that, reporting that you're happily married in this survey blows every other variable out of the water. So it blows, again, education, work, money. It blows religious attendance. It blows, sexual frequency out of the water. So all these other variables, it's more important than self-rated health. And these are all things that predict happiness, health, sex, religion, education, work, money, all these things predict happiness for the average American man and woman. But having a good marriage is far more important for the average American when it comes to their global life satisfaction. So I think what people are not appreciating when often in their teens and in their 20s is that they're thinking about their life ahead, that, getting a job at Goldman or, being a professor or being, a lawyer, whatever it might be. These things could be good things, obviously. But finding someone who is a good partner, a good spouse, who's a good parent, ends up being a lot more important than how much professional success you might have. So given that reality, when you are in college, if you're in college or in a technical school or, working somewhere else as a 20-something, being open and intentional even about finding someone who would be a good, spouse ends up being super important. And our parents, even religious parents, are often discouraging their 20-somethings from doing that in college. Hear that all the time from students.
I know, you're too young, you're only 25.
Exactly.
It's like, wait a second.
Or at UVA, you're only 21. Don't think about, marriage right now. And what I'm saying to my students and to 20-somethings more generally is that, look, if you meet a great person, you should not cross them off the list, and, if they're a great person, you should, you should get to know them. You should see if there's a basis for a strong, friendship. And if there is, and if there's some attraction there, you should kind of pursue that. There's no reason you can't get married at age 23 or 25 or 27. And so I would just, really encourage young adults to be much more intentional about kind of using college or their first job as an opportunity to kind of get to know people and to be looking for that person, who would be a good spouse.
I fully back that. What is your advice for kind of landing on the right career? There was a piece of advice given on the panel that you were on yesterday with Dr. Anthony Bradley, who we're going to talk to here in a little bit. And he said that you should not, as a man, particularly if your goal is to be that provider and that leader for your family, that husband and father, you should not pursue a career that is going to be so demanding that it sucks up all your time with your family. And that might mean less money. What's your take on that? And what kind of careers, generally, according to the research, are the best for happy and flourishing families?
Oftentimes when it comes to sort of building out a career, that sometimes the first couple of years can demand a lot, of you, in terms of time and energy, and whether it's a doctor or, someone working in the financial sector, whatever else it might be, journalism, and so having some flexibility about those first few years, I think is, can be warranted. But you've got to basically be aware of the fact that, you can't travel too much. You can't spend too many hours at the office. before your relationship with your wife or your husband or your kid starts to deteriorate. So I think kind of being cognizant of the need as you kind of move into the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh year of your marriage, to kind of put boundaries around, time is going to be important for people who are in, more high-powered careers. But I think more generally, it's just kind of important to realize that, marriages and kids are more likely to thrive when we have real in-person time together. And so you just have to kind of be aware of that reality and make decisions in kind of, that honor that reality. So I mentioned before, like this Army officer, very talented guy, and he just on numerous occasions turned down opportunities to go places in the Army because he realized it would put a strain on his marriage and his kids. And he and his wife have a number of kids. They've been stably married for a long time, and yet I know other friends in the Army who didn't pursue that strategy, and they're divorced, and their kids are, in many cases, oftentimes, we're hit pretty hard by that whole situation. So
I think a lot of people are looking for that rule of thumb because there's a lot of mixed messages, obviously. Sure. And then there are those, anomalies, that person who was, in that crazy high-powered career and their kids seem to be fine,
Sure.
or...
I think just to realize that on average, that our kids are more likely to thrive when they have lots of family time with the whole family. And I found that this is, like, for instance, like doing fun things as a family, like, hiking, athletic events. These things are all linked to in fact, better marriages and better kids outcomes as well. But I also found, surprisingly too, that doing more chores together as a family, and this is for us has been often like a crucible, extremely difficult with our kids, but was an even better predictor of marital quality. Surprised me in the data. So I think kind of actually doing productive work together as a family, which I think is often minimized in more upper middle class homes. It's, it's about soccer, it's about school, it's about, work, but not necessarily like, making dinners, doing yard work, fixing your own household stuff, right? But it turns out that stuff ends up being, even more predictive of good marital outcomes. And I think actually too, it gives kids a sense of accomplishment. We've got some friends who have founded a farm together, and so they have an organic farm that they're running. Their kids are helping out with the animals. Those kids are so virtuous and so happy. It's pretty impressive. So anyways, I'm not going to give you one rule. I'm just going to say to you that I think we have to, all of us as spouses and parents have to recognize and appreciate that time matters, and that we need to kind of be intentional about maximizing our time with our spouses and our kids, and doing both fun but also productive work in our homes.
And is part of the secret to that, because, asking these very specific questions, like how much time and how do you determine that amount of time? And I think what you're saying is it's a lot of it is a prudential decision that you make as you kind of assess how things are going. But if you're raised in a home that, was dysfunctional and there wasn't a clear model of how to do this successfully, and then you're kind of you're without a community of people that you can kind of
Sure.
not fully, not compare in a bad way, but kind of see, this is how they're doing it and it's working. This doesn't seem to be working. If you're kind of a lone ranger out there, and a lot of people I think feel like lone rangers, then they're going to the internet for like the prescription, So
Sure.
what would be that, I guess, that underlying message? It sounds like the underlying message is this has to be done in a community.
And I think we have to recognize and appreciate that if you've got family who are kind of living close to you, whether it's adult siblings or grandparents in the mix, I think things become much easier, So we, for instance, when we had our twins, my in-laws moved, from one part of Virginia to Charlottesville. And that made our life, so much easier and better. And so when it comes to navigating work and family and soccer, they're in the mix, helping to kind of take kids to soccer games and school. And so that just makes everything that much easier, and their families. So we trust them, we love them. They love and trust our children. So that's, I think, one part of the solution is sort of being, if you can, to live close to your kin, which, is not always possible, but I think people can be intentional about if they have that latitude. And then I think the other big piece in the book is religious communities. And again, not everyone's religious, but I think when you're surrounded by people who kind of share your faith, navigating the challenges again of family life, work. When we had our twins again, we had people coming, from our evangelical and Catholic network for an entire month with dinners. And we already had, other kids in the household at that point. So that was just a lifesaver, So again, I think recognizing that, we are social animals, as Aristotle said. And so having kin and having a community that you're a part of makes navigating all of these challenges today that much easier.
So another question along these veins of family life and children, we are facing a demographic winter. We're below replacement rate in the United States, meaning less than 2.1 children per couple. I think it's 1.6 or 7 now.
About 1 point. I mean, it depends. Okay. It's around 1.6, 1.7 right now.
So less people are having kids and choosing to have kids, including some married couples, or they're just having less, right. Only one child or two children. Why is this happening? And then what are the consequences of this?
So I think part of this is about what I call the Midas mindset. So if you're kind of like really chasing, work, financial success, you can kind of postpone marriage and postpone, things so that you actually end up not even having the kids maybe you wanted to have, right? Because you kind of sort of focus on something besides, or not having the number of kids that you wanted to have. So I think that's part of the story here. I think it's also the case, too, that declining marriage rates are one reason that we're seeing fertility fall in the U.S. and other parts of the world, because married couples tend to have more kids and feel more confident about having children. I also think, too, that people are kind of experiencing difficulty around kind of finding affordable housing, particularly in large metropolitan areas like Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., and so kind of difficulties finding housing can make them put off marriage and put off having kids or even forego having kids. So these are all the kinds of things that are kind of in the mix, in part because people are living online a lot more. There is a sense of anxiety. There is a sense that the world is a difficult place. There are concerns about the environment. So like these kind of newer concerns that are kind of mediated by our new technologies that I think also tend to kind of make people less inclined to, risk having a child as well. So, but I think what people don't appreciate is that for most of us, I think there is nothing that brings our lives more meaning, than having a child. Or having kids. And so kind of closing that door to children ends up, I think, depriving people of a tremendous opportunity to live a more, meaningful and powerful life. So
what would be your advice for those people who are not sure? I mean, you just said it beautifully. You can close that door to that more meaningful life. But based on the research that you've done, what does the research say about even married couples who choose not to have children?
So I think there's no question that having young children is extremely difficult in many cases and contexts. Although, again, having like in-laws, having kin, having a religious community can make that difficult experience more easily navigated, right? But there is some suffering, obviously, some sacrifice, that having young kids brings, and having teenage kids brings, obviously, as well. So I don't want to kind of sugarcoat the difficulties of parenting. And I think people see that. They'll go to like a restaurant and they'll see some, toddler having a fit, and the parents are completely undone. And that's what sort of like their impression of parenthood is. And like, I don't want that, right? Or they'll recognize that people have to make sacrifices when it comes to their career, when they have children. Like, I don't want that. But I think what they don't appreciate is sort of the way in which when we kind of give ourselves to someone else, when we give ourselves to our child, there's something beautiful and powerful about that. And it endows our lives with just such meaning and purpose. And then too, our kids become ambassadors, for us to a whole new world. So for instance, I have one of my twins, likes to make ice cream. Mm-hmm. And so she's made ice cream for our neighbors who are a bit older. So she brings them ice cream, and so we spend time with them, and just to see the look on their face, and so it kind of forges a stronger relationship with our neighbors. We've got kids who play soccer, and so, standing on the sidelines, basically exchanging pleasantries with other parents on the sidelines. So you meet new people in your community because your kids are drawing you into the school, the soccer, the youth group, and so again, the kids kind of bring you out of yourself and into your community in ways that I find to be, deeply meaningful. And so we do see that parents today report more meaningful lives, less lonely lives, and also kind of over the course of their prime adult years, more happiness. And this is kind of noteworthy because there's been a lot of research telling us that back in like the 80s and 90s, American parents were less happy than childless adults. But that relationship has flipped in recent years. And we're not entirely sure why that's the case. It might be because, parenting is more selective today. So maybe it's the kind of people who are parents just have more going for them. But I would also hazard a guess that in an age when we're spending too much time on these devices, one of the good things about being a spouse and a parent today is that if you're halfway decent spouse or halfway decent parent, you can't be online all the time, right? And so I think one of the things that being a spouse and being a parent does for us today is it kind of forces us to get off of our screens and to engage real people in the real world, including outside of our homes. So I think that could be why maybe in part we're seeing that parents. So again, so people are thinking, should I have kids? What I would want to remind them is that kind of over the course of your lives, they're going to, in the main, I think bring you so much joy and purpose, and also kind of bring you into new communities and new places that you would never have gone without the benefit of your own children.
It's beautiful. What about the elder years? Part of the demographic winter threat is that the population is unbalanced. And so you have this, a large amount of people who are in their elder years. They have greater needs. They're not kind of breadwinner in the same way. And then there's less younger people to maybe care for that aging population. What does that mean like for the at-large population? And then what does that mean also in terms of the research for the individual who is, now 80 years old? Maybe they married, maybe they didn't, but they don't have children, grandchildren. That's not part of their end-of-life experience.
Yeah, no, and the research is as with some of these topics, pretty contested about whether or not kind of older Americans who are childless, for instance, are worse off than their peers who are not. So to be honest, there's kind of a debate about that in the research. But I would also say that we have seen kind of this playing out kind of in a leading way, a whole generation of older Japanese adults who are kind of living on their own in these, large complexes and they're not visited, There's even this is a New York Times story a couple of years ago in Japan. It was just really, really sobering, talking about there's this whole industry of where they clean out apartments of people who died and were only discovered 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks after they died because there was just no one in connection with them. So that's kind of an extreme case, right? But it just sort of suggests if you're living in a world without kin, as an older person, things can get pretty bleak. And I do visit a nursing home in Charleston with my children. And, you do see, obviously, that there are some people there who, just don't have adult children. Kind of as you move into that last chapter for older Americans, it's friends and family who visit, And so you may be super invested in your work, at age 35 or 25 or 45. And so people have to remember that, at the end of the day, family and friends are most important for us.
One more topic to explore with the time we have is the whole kind of post-sexual revolution society at large, where sex is not seen as something that belongs exclusively in a marriage.
Sure.
You have a lot of premarital sexual experiences. I think the large majority of people have end up having premarital sex.
Sure.
Although I think that number might be slowly declining in research.
So sex is coming down, which is kind of surprising. I don't know about the number of. I'm not sure about the share of folks who are having sex before marriage, but
okay,
yeah, sure.
I think it's seen as a joke today to save sex for marriage. A lot of people think it's kind of a joke, and there's even people that make fun of virginity, typically. So what does the research say about premarital sex and outcomes later on in terms of happiness and, strong relationships?
Yeah, so I think what's surprising for a lot of young adults who kind of come across this research in my big family class, EVA, for instance, is that we see this work that's been done by colleagues at the University of Denver, Scott Stanley and Lila Rose, for instance, that shows us basically that when it comes to sex and kind of cohabitating relationships as well, kind of, in most things, like the more experience you have, the better. Like the more journalism you do, the better you're at it. The more tennis you play, soccer you play, piano you play, the better you're at this thing. But when it comes to kind of like serious relationships and sexual partners, what we do see is that kind of the more you have heading into a marriage, the worse you do in the marriage, both in terms of marital quality and in terms of your risk of divorce. So we don't necessarily have like the full story about why that's the case. And it's certainly surprising to a lot of my students at UVA and to folks who hear about this research in other contexts. But there is just something about having, a lot of partners be linked to worse outcomes. And again, we don't know entirely why from a social scientific perspective that's the case.
I have some theories.
Yeah, well, one theory is just, I think, kind of like this is like a comparison thing, right? So like if you're with Will, you live with Will, and he was super ambitious, and you live with John, and he was really funny and charming, and then you marry, Lawrence, and he's a great guy, but doesn't, not as ambitious or as charming as your previous, partners. You might kind of, at some point in your marriage, discount him, right? That could be part of the theory, or it could be just like the experience of like having serious breakups, might kind of give you experience with kind of like handling a difficult chapter in your relationship by, ending that relationship. Moving really quickly into a relationship, not just physically, but also emotionally, is linked to worse outcomes. For the average person, now there are exceptions, like we've all heard these stories where you kind of meet someone and there's like this immediate chemistry and they end up getting married and everything's just wonderful. But for most people, there's something about kind of taking things slowly, both emotionally and physically, that seems to kind of...
How slowly? Because some people, they're like, okay, 7 years dating, now maybe we'll get married.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying, I mean, I would say like from maybe start to marriage, it would depend on obviously the case, but like, a year or 2 or 3 years. Common scenario is that people in their 20s and even teens will kind of go, from 0 to 60 in the space of even an evening, right? And that we know is just not good, because you're not having the opportunities to kind of get to know someone and figure out, is this a good match? Mm-hmm. Do we share common commitments, common interests? Do we like fun things to do together? And you're not kind of like giving yourself and your relationship the space to kind of exercise some prudential judgment about whether or not there's a good fit.
I've heard people say pretty frequently, there's sort of the prevailing wisdom today, that it's better to live together with someone before you get married, because then you'll really get to know them.
Sure.
And they maybe would say they agree with you on tempo. Like, I really want to get to know them. And it's not just about having sex with them. It's about like really having a household with them and seeing if you're compatible.
Right.
What do you have to say to that?
So again, the research here is from Scott Stanley, this professor at the University of Denver, and what his research tells us is that kind of moving in together before you have an engagement is a bad idea. And he talks about kind of sliding versus deciding. So the idea here is that people often kind of, they're together, they're enjoying each other's company, and they just kind of slide in without kind of making some clear determinations about what's happening, where they're going. And that this is kind of like the most risky scenario, because then you're kind of locked in, right? And so you're living in an apartment together, you may sign a lease together, you may get a sofa together, they get nowadays a pet together. And so then it becomes difficult to break that relationship if it's not really like the best, fit. And so his point about kind of cohabitation today is that it's often linked to the sliding versus deciding pattern. And it's much better to kind of get to know someone slowly and then make a decision about your future together, and get engaged, get married. And again, on the research, there is some debate about the sort of like the space between an engagement and the wedding date. And there are some folks who would say you should wait until the wedding date to kind of move in. There's some folks who would say, well, at least once you're engaged, together, then it's fine. So that's where the debate is, to be honest.
Interesting. Who is most likely to be happy based on decisions and circumstances, with their relationships? I think there, is some literature now, more stories come out about how if you're a single, successful woman, the rise of sort of the very happy single woman who doesn't have, children or, an unhappy marriage holding her down. What does the research say today about who is happiest in America?
So obviously we all know people who are unhappily married, right? We all know people who are single and just killing it, right? So so there's like obviously many different life stories out there. We have to acknowledge those different stories. But on average, because we are social animals, as Aristotle said, we're most likely to be flourishing when we're in good relationships with family and friends. And so what we see is that for women today, kind of 18 to 55, women who are married with kids are the happiest. 40% of them, for instance, in the GSS are very happy compared to less than 30% of their peers who are either not married or who are childless. So there is a kind of at least premium associated with, marriage and motherhood today that, we see in terms of the sort of happiness story. Now, scholars will kind of debate about whether or not marriage per se or motherhood per se is the thing driving that story. But I think we can't kind of minimize the fact that a lot of folks are saying that single childless women are the ones who are most likely to be flourishing today. And I'm saying, well, empirically, that's not true. And so we should kind of give people some comfort about making the jump into marriage and the jump into motherhood in terms of just recognizing that at least today, married moms are the ones most likely to be happy, but also, of course, most likely to be reporting meaningful lives. They're the least lonely, et cetera. Again, motherhood is extremely challenging. Marriage can be obviously very challenging at times, as with any relationship, right? But then on average, because we are social animals, we're most likely to be flourishing when we're embedded in these profound relationships. Friendship is incredibly important. I think sharing common values, but also common loves of some sort. It could be, hiking, it could be soccer, it could be whatever, but having something that you kind of enjoy as a couple doing together. And then also kind of sharing commitment to lifelong marriage. I mean, we know that people who have this commitment to marriage are more likely to flourish. So kind of recognizing it's not just sort of being married, it's kind of appreciating that marriage itself matters as an institution is helpful. And then for folks who are married, I would say I could talk about 5 pillars in the book. Talk about communion, kind of the sense that it's about we before me, fostering that sense of communion in your marriage. Date nights, for instance, are incredibly important, especially once you have kids, to kind of have that time as a couple to foster that communion. The second thing is children. So it's 5 C's, children, kind of appreciating that your marriage matters not just for you, but also for your kids, and trying to work to make your marriage strong for the sake of your children. That doesn't mean helicoptering them, but it just means that you kind of appreciate that you're in this as a couple together, not just for your sake and his sake or her sake, but for the sake of your children if you have them. The third C is commitment, kind of recognizing that commitment to marital permanence and to fidelity are the foundations for strong marriages. We see in the research that commitment in general is the number one predictor of marital quality for Americans.
Wow.
So keeping that in mind, kind of knowing that your spouse really puts you first. The fourth C is cash, kind of having a regular stream of cash. I mean, money matters. And we talked before about, and that's, especially the role of the husband. That's not BC, but it's true. And the fifth C is community, being surrounded by a community that honors your marriage and honors family and challenges you to be a better husband, a better wife, a better father, a better mother, So if you're surrounding yourself with people who are really intentional about being good husbands, good wives, good fathers, good mothers, you're much more likely to flourish. We know that birds of a feather flock together. And so when it comes to divorce, for instance, to kind of wrap this thing up, like one of the best predictors of divorce is having a close sibling or a close friend get divorced. One of the best predictors of avoiding divorce is having a family, that has steered clear of divorce and having friends that steer clear of divorce. Because we tend to take cues, from our friends and family. And so if you've seen a friend kind of respond to a challenge in their marriage by getting divorced, you're probably going to get divorced or consider getting divorced when you're experiencing a challenge. By contrast, if you see a friend kind of navigate a difficult chapter in their marriage by working with their spouse, to get through this difficult chapter, when you face that difficulty in your marriage, you're going to kind of do the same. So again, the community piece is important, and people should be intentional about kind of looking for a community that's going to support their marriage and their kids and their kind of their way of life as a family.
Excellent advice. Everybody pre-order Get Married. Get Married. It sounds like it's going to be a phenomenal book. Where can people find your work, Brad?
So Family Studies is a great place for my work, and then I'm on Twitter as well, Brad Wilcox IFS.
He's a great Twitter follow. Check him out.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Brad.
Sure.